Great, thanks. Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. Fantastic campaign, and even if we don't achieve completely plant-based, hopefully it will move in the right direction. So I'm a psychologist, I'm in the psychology department here, and I do work on behaviour change, sort of cognitive interventions to try and help people change their eating behaviour in line with their goals. So I'm just going to briefly talk about why we eat meat, why we need to reduce it, which I'm sure a lot of you know about already, and trying to summarise the main findings from the psychology research on what the main barriers and facilitators are to people reducing their meat. And this is a really good review at the bottom here. You can see by Chris Bryant, who's a great researcher. He was also recently on Come Dine With Me, the vegan one, based in Bath. So I recommend people reading that if they're interested in this topic. It's a great review. So obviously people eat meat because it's cheap, and that's because it's heavily subsidized. It wouldn't be cheap if it was truly sold at the cost of production. It's really convenient because it's sold everywhere, often in ready meals, and we have very strong cultural norms, particularly in the West and in Europe, and in the US and Australia, countries like that, and in the Americas, to eat a lot of meat. And this is just a selection of very recent adverts for Valentine's Day, and you can see all of the adverts. Really, meat is like front and center of how to treat someone on Valentine's Day. And also people really like the taste, and those are the main drivers of people continuing to eat meat. And now, as everybody knows, it has a terrible impact on the environment. So as we heard already from some of the other speakers, it uses a huge amount of our land. It's very inefficient, so it uses a lot of energy and land to produce a small amount of our overall calories. We eat much more protein than we need. You know, everyone's worried about protein intake, but we don't need as much protein. It's responsible for over half of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and agriculture accounts for about 14% of global emissions. And so you can see that, you know, if you completely cut out animal products from your diet, you are slashing your greenhouse gas and other environmental impacts. So up to sort of 90% of lower carbon dioxide emissions if you go vegan, for example. And health is also really important. So as we just heard from Fatma, it's really important to eat whole foods and, you know, fresh vegetables, whole grains. And you can see this is an analysis from a group in Oxford, where they have plotted the environmental impacts on this axis. And note it goes from 1 to 100, so it's not a linear scale. So the meats at the top are 100 times more impactful on the environment than the foods at the bottom. And then down on this axis, you've got the effects on health. So you can see red meat really stands out as having a terrible environmental impact, and it's also really bad for our health, particularly processed red meat. Eggs also not great in this analysis, but down here you can see nuts, whole grains, fruits and vegetables actually lower your risk of mortality. So when we talk about meat reduction, as people were saying, it's important to try and replace them with more fruits and vegetables, because these are actually good for your health. So overall, people who don't eat meat and replace them with these foods tend to have lower mortality. Now, that's not the only impact, of course. You get huge environmental pollution due to livestock, loss of biodiversity, all the habitat loss for wildlife, and that leads us to come into contact with wild animals, which increases the risk of zoonotic disease like COVID. And the various environmental impacts have led people to say that actually we could solve basically global warming if we all just cut out meat. Which seems crazy. I don't know if you've seen the film Don't Look Up, but imagine you told everybody you can stop the comet crashing into planet Earth and killing us all if you just all stop eating meat. You know, would we do that to prevent that such catastrophe? And that's kind of like what we're facing, but people don't seem to be willing to do it, which is a bit odd. So the message is really getting, you know, every time there's an evidence review, it's clear that we really need to reduce our meat intake. That's going to have the biggest impact. And so various independent groups commissioned by the government have looked into this, and they've come up with some policy recommendations. So Climate Change Committee recently said we should reduce by 20% by 2030, 35% by 2050. So of course you could get everybody to reduce their own intake by that amount, or you could just try and persuade, you know, 35% of the population to go meat-free, for example. Last year, the National Food Strategy, another independent review commissioned, came up with very similar recommendations of a 30% decrease over the next 10 years. And the way they suggested to do that was all these suggestions here. So changing the reference diet, that Eat Well guide, to massively reduce the meat, changing school meals, which is something FATMA's been working on, changing procurement for like prisons and hospitals so that they buy in more sustainable food using taxpayers' money, having policies that change how we use land, so encouraging farmers, like there's some DEFRA incentives at the moment to plant trees and use the land as a sort of carbon sink to absorb carbon instead of adding to it. Funding research into alternative proteins. So in Europe and the US, they're putting huge amounts of money into alternative proteins. It's a massive growth area, and we're lagging behind in the UK. But clearly, if you can produce good substitutes that people like and are very nutritious, then that's got all sorts of positive impacts. Interestingly, all of these groups have not recommended something like the meat tax. And in general, if you go to public and kind of have focus groups and that kind of thing, people are really anti anything that just takes away choice. So that might be something to think about with this plant-based unis. I think this general transition is a much better idea. And the meat tax, people say, is regressive because it would increase the price of processed meat products like mince a lot more than steak. So it would penalise poorer groups in society. So what should we be eating? This is the proposed optimal diet for human health and the environment, so the planetary health diet. So it really includes every nutrient. They've kept some animal protein in, just I think because they were hoping that it was more acceptable and that people might actually take it up. So what that looks like in reality, that's just converting that plate of a day's intake into amounts. So you can see the amount of animal protein is really, really tiny here. So, a fifth of an egg a day. So that's really just one egg a week. And you probably wouldn't even have one burger a week if you were following this diet.